Okay, let's dive in. We're tackling a question today that has truly sparked debate for centuries, really.
Mhm.
How literally should we read the story of creation in Genesis? Specifically those 7 days. Were they, 24 hours each?
Yeah.
Or is there something maybe more complex going on?
It's a huge question, foundational for many people. And the sources you shared, they really reveal just how many different ways folks have wrestled with it over time.
Absolutely. This deep dive is built entirely around the questions you brought us and the fascinating source material you provided. I mean, everything from a really lively Reddit thread hashing out details
Yeah, I saw them.
to insights from scholars and religious organizations. It gives us a really robust range of perspectives to explore.
That's right. And our goal here, it isn't to tell you what you should believe about the Genesis creation account. Not at all.
Now,
It's more about taking the stack of sources and, unpacking the different ways people have understood this incredibly important story and what the material reveals about its original context and, well, its enduring meaning.
okay, let's unpack this mystery then. So the core questions you were grappling with, which honestly jumped right off the page in the sources, include things like, is Genesis 1 this account of creation in 7 days? Is it meant to be read as literal history? Or is it maybe poetry or metaphor or something else entirely?
And you also hit on that idea that you hear quite often that one day for God is like 1,000 years for humans.
Right.
Does that calculation mean creation actually took 7,000 years? Though it's probably worth noting right away, as one source clarifies.
Yeah.
This idea, from Tech and Peter or Psalm 90, it's generally used more as a metaphor for God's timelessness or maybe his patience, not usually as a literal time conversion formula for the creation week itself.
That's a helpful clarification right off the bat.
Yeah.
And a huge question, obviously. Do Christians, or maybe people from other faiths engaging with these texts, do they actually hold wildly different views on this?
Oh, absolutely. The sources make it abundantly clear that they do. There's a huge range.
Huge range. Okay.
Definitely. And perhaps most personally relevant for many listeners, does God mind if someone interprets this story differently than, say, a strict 24-hour day view?
That's a big one.
Yeah, and some sources suggest that for many believers, how you interpret the 7 days isn't considered like a central requirement for salvation. It's not a salvation issue for everyone.
Which really broadens the conversation, doesn't it? Takes some pressure off, maybe.
It can, yeah.
So let's start peeling back the layers presented in these sources. A key point that surfaced, especially in that Reddit discussion you mentioned, revolves around a single Hebrew word, yom.
Yes, yom, that's the word translated as day all through Genesis 1.
Okay.
And what's interesting, as pointed out in the sources, is that yom doesn't always mean a strict 24-hour solar day in the Bible. It just doesn't.
Really?
Yeah, it can and often does in other contexts mean a longer sort of non-specific period of time. It could be a literal day, sure, but it could also mean a year, an epoch, maybe even an eon. It's flexible.
Okay, so if you interpret yom here as, say, time span instead of precisely day, how? How might that change how you read the creation account?
Well, the argument, according to this perspective in the sources, is that it allows the Genesis narrative to potentially align a bit better with the vast timescales suggested by modern geology and cosmology.
Ah, I see.
If day means a long period, then the sequence of events could, at least in theory, map onto scientific history in some way. People try to do that.
But that's definitely not the end of the discussion, is it?
What?
I saw a strong counterpoint raised within the sources, too.
Exactly. You've got proponents of the literal view pointing straight to Exodus 20.1. That's part of the 10 Commandments given to Moses.
Right, the Sabbath commandment.
Precisely. It states, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day." So the argument there is that this verse, often attributed to Moses himself, explicitly links the human week and the Sabbath to God's 6 days of creation and the 7th day of rest. The implication being, these must be literal days, just like our own week.
So right from the start, we see this linguistic and inter-biblical debate shaping the core interpretation. Very interesting.
Definitely.
Let's lean into that literal interpretation for a moment as it's presented in the sources. What's the core idea?
Okay, so this view asserts that God created everything in 6 literal consecutive 24-hour days, and then he rested on the 7th. Simple as that.
And the reasoning behind it.
Well, the primary driving force behind this interpretation is often a really strong belief in God's omnipotence, his power.
Makes sense.
If God is all-powerful, then creating everything in 6 days is, easily within his capability. He could even have done it instantaneously if he chose. 6 days is almost leisurely in that view.
And what's the objection from this viewpoint to a non-literal reading, like the idea of millions of years?
One source puts it quite strongly, actually. It argues that saying creation took millions of years essentially ruins God's goodness.
How so?
The logic presented is this. If millions of years happened, with all the evidence we see of death, disease, animal struggle in the fossil record, if all that occurred before the fall of man described later in Genesis,
Right, before sin entered the picture.
exactly, then God would seem responsible for introducing death and suffering into the world before human sin existed. And this view sees that as fundamentally incompatible with God's perfectly good character. Death is seen as a result of the fall, not part of the original creation.
I see the tension there. The sources also mention young Earth creationism, YEC. That's the term for this literal six-day view, right?
That's the one. It's associated with this literal interpretation.
And there was even a minor conflict within the Reddit thread about how long this view has been dominant historically.
Yeah, that was interesting. One person suggested it's only really been the standard view for maybe the last 150 years, while another countered it was the norm for maybe 200 years before facing more recent challenges from science and other interpretations.
So even the history of the view is debated a bit.
It highlights that, yeah. And literalists also sometimes argue that Jesus himself implicitly affirmed a literal creation account.
How do they argue that?
They point to passages like Mark 10.6 and Matthew 19.4, where Jesus talks about humanity existing from the beginning of creation.
Okay.
And they also connect this back, again, to the Sabbath command in Exodus 20.11. The reasoning is, if Jesus upheld the commandments, he must have accepted their foundation in a literal six-day creation.
So there's a significant theological and textual basis presented for the literal view in the sources.
Absolutely. It's a coherent position for many.
But the sources also present a wealth of arguments for non-literal interpretations. It's not just one alternative.
Not at all. For many others, Genesis is understood quite differently, maybe as metaphorical, allegorical, or even as religious poetry or myth.
And using myth there in the academic sense,
Yeah.
right? Not meaning false story.
Exactly. In that academic sense of an origin story that conveys deep truths about reality, God, and humanity, even if it's not literal history.
And what's the core reason driving this non-literal perspective, according to the sources?
A central argument you see repeatedly is that the Bible simply isn't intended to be read as a science textbook.
Okay.
According to these sources, Genesis's primary purpose is theological and existential. It's focused on explaining who created everything that's God and why he created, maybe to establish humanity's place, our purpose, the rhythm of rest. It's not focused on detailing the scientific how or the precise material mechanisms and timeline.
So it's more about meaning and relationship, less about a scientific blueprint.
Precisely. That's the argument. Some sources are quite blunt about it, stating that trying to take Genesis 1 as a strict scientific or historical account creates, and this is a quote, giant, enormous problems.
Wow.
Why?
Because, they argue, it conflicts fundamentally with what modern science has revealed about the age of the universe, the development of the earth, and the evolution of life.
And this is where the discussion about the two different creation accounts in Genesis really comes into play, isn't it?
It's a major point raised in the sources, yeah. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 describe creation, but they do so with different details and even a different sequence of events.
Very good.
While the order of creation is different, for one, man's creation relative to plants and animals, for instance.
Okay.
So as one source notes, if you insist on taking Genesis 1 as factually true down to every single detail, you immediately run into apparent contradictions with the details presented in Genesis 2.
Which suggests...
It suggests to many scholars that they might not both be intended as purely literal, factual history in the same way. They might have different purposes or use different literary styles.
This leads us nicely into one of the fascinating non-literal approaches mentioned, the framework interpretation. What's that about?
The framework interpretation, or framework view, sees Genesis 1 specifically, verses 1.1 through 2.4a, not as a chronological historical account, step by step, but as a highly structured literary device, a theological framework.
Okay, a literary structure. How does that work?
It highlights the parallel structure of the first 6 days. They're often described as forming two triads. Days 1, 2, and 3 establish the realms or domains, light and dark, sky and water, land and vegetation.
Right, setting the stage.
Exactly. And then days 4, 5, and 6 populate those realms. Sun, moon, stars for the light-dark realm, birds and fish for the sky-water realm, land, animals, and humans for the land vegetation realm. It's very patterned.
And day 7 is the completion, the rest.
Exactly. It's the culmination. This view often interprets Genesis 1 as God symbolically building the cosmos as his temple, a sacred space where creation culminates in God resting and humanity dwelling and worshiping within it.
So it's about theology and structure, not sequence.
That's the idea. By focusing on this literary structure and the theological message, God as the orderly creator, the significance of Sabbath rest in this interpretation seeks to exist in harmony with scientific understanding. It sees Genesis as conveying deep theological truths through a specific, non-literal literary structure.
What about the day-age interpretation we touched on earlier, understanding yom as long periods? Is that different from the framework view?
Yes, it's another significant non-literal view, but distinct. The day-age view interprets day, or yom, as representing vast epochs or eons, long periods of time.
Okay.
And proponents of this view often attempt what are called concordist models. These are efforts to try and align the sequence of events described in Genesis 1 with scientific timelines.
Trying to make them match up.
Kind of, yeah. One source even offers a potential mapping, though these are always speculative. Like day 1 could represent the initial cosmic beginnings, maybe the Big Bang era. Day 3, the formation of continents and the emergence of plant life.
Interesting. What about the later days?
Day 4 might be when the atmosphere cleared enough for the sun, moon, and stars to become clearly visible from Earth's surface, not necessarily their creation, but their appearance. Day 5 may be the age of marine life and birds, perhaps even including dinosaurs and their later extinction.
Wow. And day 6?
Day 6 could then represent the appearance of mammals, various hominids, leading eventually up to Homo sapiens.
That's quite detailed.
Yeah.
And didn't that same source have a particularly complex take on Adam and Eve within that model?
It did. A very specific variation proposed was that maybe Adam and Eve were created much later, perhaps even after these symbolic 7 days or epochs had concluded, maybe through some form of special divine intervention like genetic engineering is suggested.
Whoa.
Yeah, and in this specific model, other forms of early mankind, perhaps those who didn't have souls in the same theological sense, could have evolved earlier, on day 6, outside the Garden of Eden.
That's intricate.
It shows just how detailed some attempts to reconcile the text with science can become. It's quite creative. The sources also note, stepping back a bit, that Genesis 2, with its focus on humanity and plants in the garden...
The second creation story.
Right. It might actually represent an older tradition about origins compared to the grand cosmic sweep of Genesis 1.
This idea of different traditions, older and newer, leads us naturally into looking more closely at the historical and literary context of Genesis 1 and 2.
Yeah.
The sources really emphasize this is crucial for understanding the text, don't they?
Absolutely crucial. This is where the different layers of meaning really start to emerge and make more sense.
So what's the key finding here?
Well, what's really fascinating is the strong scholarly consensus, based on analyzing the text itself, that Genesis 1, specifically chapter 1 through 2.3, and Genesis 2, starting at 2.4, are likely two distinct creation narratives.
Two separate stories originally.
That's the view. Likely originating from different times or communities, which were later skillfully woven together by editors. These are often associated with different proposed source traditions within the Torah.
Right, I've heard of those.
Commonly called the priestly source, or P, for Genesis 1, and the Jahwist source, J, for Genesis 2.
Okay, P and J. What kind of evidence points to them being distinct stories? It reads pretty smoothly.
A key piece of evidence mentioned in the sources is the different names used for God. Genesis 1 almost exclusively uses Elohim, which is a more general Hebrew term for God or divinity,
Okay.
whereas Genesis 2 primarily uses Yahweh Elohim, often translated as Lord God, using the personal covenant name Yahweh.
Ah, I see.
Now, while traditional interpretations might see this as just a single author varying names for stylistic or theological reasons, critical scholarship often sees this difference in divine names as a major clue pointing towards different underlying source documents being combined.
And their focus is quite different too, isn't it? Beyond just the names.
Hugely different. Genesis 1 has this vast cosmic scope. Creation happens through divine command. God speaks things into existence, let there be light, and names them. It's very orderly, structured, almost liturgical in feel.
Like a grand pronouncement.
Exactly. Genesis 2, on the other hand, is much more focused, more intimate. It centers on the human story, Adam and Eve, in a specific location, the garden.
Right.
And God is depicted more anthropomorphically, more human-like in description. He's described as a craftsman, using the Hebrew verb yatsar, which means fashioning or shaping, like a potter molding Adam from dust.
Very hands-on.
Very. And God breathes life, nephesh, into humanity. The creation sequence also differs significantly, as we mentioned. In Genesis 2, man is created before the garden is planted and before many animals appear, which is distinct from the order in Genesis 1.
And you mentioned Genesis 2.4 seems to act as a kind of bridge between them.
That's right. The phrase, "these are the generations," or toledot in Hebrew, found in Genesis 2.4, serves as a literary link. It connects the grand cosmic account of Genesis 1 to the more focused, human-centric narrative of Genesis 2, even though the underlying stories likely originated independently and had different emphasis.
So not necessarily contradictory, but maybe complementary.
That's how many scholars and sources see it. Not contradictory in purpose, but complementary. Genesis 1 provides the big, universal picture, God creating everything. Genesis 2 provides the intimate focus on humanity's creation, purpose, and relationship with God and the rest of creation, especially the land.
And crucially, these stories weren't just, conjured out of thin air in isolation. The sources make a strong case for significant influence from the wider culture of the ancient Near East.
Yes, this is absolutely critical for understanding the original context and message. Scholars see clear parallels, but also significant differences when comparing Genesis with creation myths from neighboring cultures, particularly Babylonian ones like the Enuma Elish or the Atrahasis epic.
Okay, what are some of those parallels people see?
Well, you find some shared themes. Things like bringing order out of a pre-existing chaotic watery state, the separation of waters to create sky and earth, the creation of humankind, even the idea of building a divine dwelling or temple, which, as we mentioned, some see Genesis 1 implying for the whole cosmos.
Interesting.
The Atrahasis epic, for instance, shares elements like a divine garden setting and explores themes around the relationship between gods, humans, and animals, similar in some ways to Genesis 2:3.
But the sources really stress that Genesis isn't just copying these myths, right? It seems to be actively engaging with them, maybe even critiquing them.
This is the crucial part, where the unique theological message of Genesis really shines through. While it might borrow familiar themes or motifs from the surrounding culture, which makes sense, it's speaking to people in that culture. Genesis is fundamentally different. It's radically monotheistic. One powerful, supreme, and good God. This stands in stark contrast to the messy, often violent polytheism you find in myths like Enuma Elish. In those stories, gods are often limited, they fight amongst themselves, they engage in brutal battles to establish order.
Not the picture in Genesis 1.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Genesis depicts God creating effortlessly, simply through speaking his word. There's no divine battle, no struggle. And crucially, Genesis portrays humanity created in God's image, given dignity and stewardship, intended for relationship and purpose.
How is that different from the Babylonian view?
In Enuma Elish, humans are created almost as an afterthought, basically as slaves to do the menial work the younger gods didn't want to do so the gods can rest. It's a very different understanding of humanity's value and purpose.
Wow, that's a major contrast.
Huge. So Genesis uses familiar cultural building blocks but completely reframes them, subverts them even, to declare its unique belief in a single, good, all-powerful creator and the inherent dignity and purpose of humankind. It's both borrowing and polemicizing.
The cosmology described in Genesis, the picture of the world, also seems rooted in that ancient worldview, according to the sources.
It does. Genesis seems to reflect the common ancient Near Eastern understanding of the cosmos at the time. That is, typically a flat, disc-shaped Earth,
Okay.
covered by a solid dome or firmament like a hammered-out bowl holding back waters above, and then there were waters below the Earth as well. The sun, moon, and stars were thought to be set in this firmament.
Which is obviously quite different from our understanding today.
Very different from later Greek philosophical models of a spherical Earth, let alone modern scientific understanding of the solar system and universe. This reinforces the idea, for many interpreters, that the text is speaking in the cultural and scientific language of its original audience. It's not attempting to provide a timeless scientific account of cosmology.
That makes sense. Now, here's another point from the sources that really surprised me. The idea of creatio ex nihilo. Creation from absolutely nothing. I kind of always assumed that was the main point of Genesis 1, God making everything out of absolutely nothing.
It's a core doctrine today, absolutely central in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theology. But surprisingly, the sources suggest that the explicit concept of God creating the entire universe out of absolute nothingness isn't actually stated directly in Genesis 1 or really anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible.
Really? So where did it come from?
It seems to have emerged as a distinct theological doctrine much later. It really started to solidify in early Christianity, maybe around the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, as theologians were engaging with Greek philosophical ideas about origins and eternity of matter.
So if the original author of Genesis 1 wasn't necessarily focused on creation from nothing, what was the focus, according to this view in the sources?
According to one line of interpretation mentioned, the priestly author of Genesis 1 might have been more concerned with describing God bringing order and assigning functions to pre-existing chaotic material described as the formless and void waters in Genesis 1.2. The focus was on God establishing the functional cosmos, not necessarily the absolute origin of the raw material itself.
Ordering chaos rather than making matter itself.
That's one perspective. However, it's important to note, as another source points out, that Genesis 1 still clearly describes the entire material universe coming into being solely by God's will and command. Even if the later, more philosophical concept of creation from absolute non-existence wasn't explicitly formulated in the text itself, the text certainly presents God as the ultimate source of all that is.
Okay, that nuance is important. And Genesis 1 isn't even the only creation concept hinted at in the Bible. The sources mentioned others.
No, interestingly, the sources briefly mention that besides the Logos model creation through divine speech, which is dominant in Genesis 1 and echoed later, for instance, in John 1, in the beginning was the Word, the Bible also contains echoes or allusions to an older agon or struggle model of creation.
A struggle model, like a battle.
Sorta, yeah. In this imagery, God establishes order by engaging in cosmic combat, defeating mythical sea monsters or forces that represent chaos. Figures like Yam, Leviathan, or Rahab, which you find referenced in passages like Psalm 74 or Isaiah 51.
Wow.
It suggests that the biblical authors drew on a diversity of ways to conceive of and express God's creative power acting upon chaos to bring about the ordered world. Genesis 1's peaceful spoken creation is just one, albeit very dominant, portrayal.
Fascinating. Okay, let's circle back specifically to Genesis 1 for a moment, looking at some of the specific symbolism and structure beyond just the framework idea that the sources highlight.
The number 7 is incredibly significant throughout Genesis 1. It's not just that there are 7 days. Scholars have noted deliberate counts of key words, phrases, even the number of times God is mentioned, often revolving around multiples of 7 or the number 7 itself. It seems to be a deliberate literary device emphasizing ideas of completion, perfection, wholeness, and divine order. It's not accidental numerology. It's part of the literary artistry reinforcing the theme. God's work is complete and perfect, culminating on the 7th day.
And the cosmic temple idea again. How does that connect?
It's a really powerful metaphor suggested by the structure and language. Some scholars argue Genesis 1 deliberately mirrors the structure and process of building the tabernacle or later the temple in Jerusalem. By first establishing the sacred space, days 1 to 3, creating the structures of the cosmos, and then filling it with inhabitants and functioning components, days 4 to 6, the furniture and worshippers. The culmination is God's rest, his taking up residence or presence on the 7th day. This makes the entire cosmos God's holy dwelling place.
That's a beautiful image.
It is, and within that, God's acts of creation through speaking, let there be, and naming things, are presented as acts of ultimate sovereignty and authority, establishing order and defining reality.
And humanity's unique role within this cosmic temple.
Humanity is uniquely made in God's image. This sets humans apart from all other creatures and implies, among other things, that humans are meant to be God's representatives or viceroys within creation.
Given authority.
Yes, given authority or dominion over creation, as the text says. And the acts described in Genesis 2, like Adam naming the animals and later the woman, are often seen as exercises of this God-given authority and discernment.
What about the vegetarian diet mentioned?
The initial description in Genesis 1 of the diet for both humans and animals being exclusively vegetarian is often interpreted as reflecting an original state of perfect peace and harmony within creation, no bloodshed, no predation before the fall, and the changes described later in Genesis.
And of course, the 7th day itself.
Absolutely central. God's rest on the 7th day doesn't just complete creation. It establishes the pattern for the Sabbath, setting apart a rhythm of work and rest that becomes fundamental to Israelite life and worship, a sign of the covenant.
Okay, let's just quickly touch on some specific details from the Genesis 2 account that are highlighted in the sources, contrasting with Genesis 1.
Right. Genesis 2 provides that much more intimate picture. God as a potter or craftsman, fashioning Yatsar, the man, directly from the Adama, the dust or ground.
Very earthy.
Very earthy. And then breathing the breath of life, Nishmat Chayim, leading to Nefesh Chaya, into him, giving him not just biological life, but a living soul or living being. It's a much more personal, hands-on interaction than the divine command we see in Genesis 1.
And the creation of the woman in Genesis 2.
Also very distinct. Woman is created not from the dust, but from the man's side. The word is Sela, often translated rib. She's described as an Ezer Chnedu.
Which means?
It's a complex phrase. Ezer means helper, but often in the Bible refers to vital, strong help, even divine help. And Chnedu means something like corresponding to him, alongside him, or his counterpart. So, not a subordinate servant, but a suitable partner, corresponding in nature.
Okay.
While the text does say the man named the woman, Isha, woman, from Ish, man, which in that culture could imply authority, the traditional interpretation often emphasizes her being taken from his side, from his very being, to highlight their equal dignity, fundamental relatedness, and the intimacy of the partnership. Not hierarchy, but unity.
And there was a linguistic connection mentioned too.
Yeah, one source mentions a fascinating possible linguistic wordplay or connection. The name Eve, Era in Hebrew, is related to the word for living. And there's a Sumerian goddess Ninti, whose name can mean both Lady of the Rib and Lady who makes live.
Whoa!
So it's possible there's some ancient wordplay or cultural resonance being drawn upon in the Genesis 2 narrative about the creation of the living woman from a rib. It just adds another layer of potential meaning.
It's incredible how much depth and how many layers are packed into these opening chapters when you start looking at them through these different lenses.
It really is.
So, pulling all of this together now, what does this deep dive into your sources ultimately tell us about that initial question, the nature of the 7 days?
Well, I think it shows pretty definitively that there is no single, simple, universally agreed upon interpretation of those 7 days. Not historically, not among religious scholars today, not even within specific faith traditions like Christianity.
Right.
The sources reflect a vibrant, complex, ongoing conversation with a wide variety of sincere attempts to understand a foundational text that's grappling with ultimate questions about God, the world, and us.
And if we step back from the specific debate about 24 hours versus long ages versus literary framework, what's the kind of unifying message or purpose that many of these interpretations, even the non-literal ones, seem to agree on based on the sources?
That's a great question. Several sources really highlight that the primary purpose of the Genesis creation narrative for many who study it deeply seems to be theological and existential, rather than aiming to provide a literal scientific or historical account of material origins, step by step.
Meaning
It's fundamentally about declaring who God is, the sole, sovereign, good creator. It's about establishing humanity's profound connection and responsibility to both God and creation. It's about providing a cosmic framework of order, purpose, and meaning. And it's about grounding fundamental aspects of life and worship, like the rhythm of work and rest embodied in the Sabbath. It seems far more focused on the who and the why of creation than the scientific how and when.
And why is understanding all these different layers, the literary aspects, the historical context, the range of interpretations, why is that so valuable for you, the listener, grappling with this?
Because I think engaging with all this, the literary structure, the ancient Near Eastern context, the influence of neighboring myths, the different ways people have read it throughout history, it allows you to appreciate the incredible richness and complexity of the text itself.
It's not just one thing.
Exactly. It moves you beyond perhaps feeling stuck between a stark, potentially brittle literalism on one hand, and maybe outright dismissal on the other. It offers a pathway to an informed perspective, one that recognizes the text's original context, its literary artistry, and its enduring theological power, regardless of how you personally end up understanding the specific timeline of the 7 days.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Now, your original questions also touched briefly on some other big topics, things like original sin, the Messiah, prophecies.
Yeah.
Do the sources tie those directly back to the specifics of the 7 creation days themselves?
The sources do mention those important topics, of course, but they generally seem to frame them as separate, although clearly connected theological discussions.
Yep.
So while the fall narrative in Genesis 3 is undoubtedly foundational for later Christian doctrines like original sin, the specific debate we focused on today about the nature and timeline of the creation days in Genesis 1, the sources often treat that as a distinct question from these later theological developments that build upon the creation story.
Got it. We stuck to the creation days focus. Well, this has been a really, truly fascinating journey through so many different ways of reading and understanding a text that's just so central for so many people.
It really has been. We've explored literal views, we've looked at metaphorical and day-age or epic interpretations, the literary framework idea, the really eye-opening influence of the ancient Near Eastern context, and the distinct nature and complementarity of the two Genesis accounts themselves. Lots to chew on.
Definitely. So here's maybe a final thought to leave with you, the listener. If Genesis 1 is perhaps less focused on giving us the precise scientific or historical timeline of how God created,
Hmm.
and maybe more concerned with establishing who the creator is and the ordered, purposeful, and ultimately good nature of that creation.
Mm.
What might that imply about how we see the world around us and perhaps our own place and responsibility within it today?
That is something definitely worth pondering on your own.